Hello, I'm Shahidha Bari and I'm one of the fellows of the Forum for Philosophy at the LSE. Welcome to this event, which is one in our ongoing series of Philosophers Book Club events. And this has become a regular part of the Forum's programming. For the book club, the idea is that we select a work of fiction or non-fiction and we invite you to read the work and then come to discuss it with us. We try to put together a panel of critics and philosophers, sometimes the writers themselves, to help us steer the discussion. If you've missed any of the previous book club events, you might like to look up the back catalogue of podcasts on our website. That's blogs.lse.ac.uk/the forum. There you'll find discussions with Deborah Levy on her memoir, The Cost of Living, and a book club dedicated to Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman. Our event today, of course, centres on Iris Murdoch's novel of 1954, Under the Net. Hopefully some of you will have read it, but if not, perhaps you may be persuaded to do so after this discussion. I should say that we will not be issuing any spoiler alerts because it's not Gone Girl. There are no huge dramatic plot twists that knowing in advance would spoil your reading. And also it was published in 1954, so it's a bit late for spoiler alerts 70 years on. Our expert panellists, though, will be steering us through the book for about 45 minutes, and then we'll hand over to you for questions. So do just type your questions in the chat box as we go along, and we'll do our best to get to them. So let me introduce you to our panel. Dr. Hannah Marije Altorf is a philosopher. Her research focuses on the philosophical work of Iris Murdoch and the notion of imagination. She has a book on Murdoch called Iris Murdoch and the Art of Imagining, published by Continuum in 2008. And she's written numerous articles on Murdoch too. Together with Mariette Williamson, she translated Murdoch's The Sovereignty of Good into Dutch. Dr. Lucy Bolton is Reader in Film Studies at Queen Mary University of London. Her research focuses on film and philosophy with particular interests in feminist philosophy and phenomenology. And her most recent monograph, helpfully for us, is Contemporary Cinema and the Philosophy of Iris Murdoch, published by Edinburgh University Press. And Dr. Mara-Daria Cojocaru is lecturer in practical philosophy at Munich School of Philosophy. She's particularly interested in thinking about animals, also relevant to this book this week. Both she and Hannah are members of the Women in Philosophy network, and Mara is also an esteemed poet, publishing 2 volumes of poetry in German. Welcome, Hannah, Lucy, and Mara. Hello.
Hello.
It's lovely for you to join us. I'm really excited to get your expert guidance in reading this book. It's such a beloved book too. I've asked each of you to select a passage from the book in advance to introduce it and read it, and we'll use that as a springboard to open up our discussion. But let's set up the book a little bit. I'd like to know, first of all, when did you first read it and what were your first impressions of it? Lucy, why don't you go first?
It wasn't my first Murdoch book, actually, I have to say. I think it was my third. I started with ones that my mum recommended because she's a huge Iris Murdoch fan. She said, oh, you must read The Bell and you must read The Sea, the Sea. And then I thought I'd start at the beginning and went back to Under the Net. And I think it probably has become one of my favourites, definitely in my top 3. And that would have been in my teens, probably pre-university, probably sixth form. Yeah.
I'm intrigued that your mum likes Murdoch. I think women of a certain generation she really speaks to as a kind of contemporary.
I don't know that she really. She's read them all, and she's always been a huge fan of Iris as a woman and a philosopher and a writer and a thinker as well. So, yeah, I kind of imbibed it, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. The generational consumption of Murdoch. Hannah, what about you? When did you first read it, and what did you think?
So I found, actually I have 2 copies of the book. I found that last week. And when I opened the second copy, I found a train ticket from Nijmegen to Maastricht dated the 2nd of April, 1999.
Wow.
So yeah. Quite an accurate way of dating my first reading of it. I have a sort of strange introduction to Murdoch in the sense that I noticed her work, her literary work, in the library for a very long time, and would always pass it and think I should read one of those. But I first read Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals. So her philosophy was my first introduction. And then I turned to the novels. It's also not the first novel I read. And it's not my favorite still, but it's grown on me. I like it better every time I read it. So I think give it another 5 readings, and I think it
that bodes well. Another 20 years of reading. Brilliant. And Mara, when did you first read it?
Yes, so I believe I'm the newcomer to this then, because I think I read her first when in 2018, late in 2018, Hannah and another colleague of ours, Anna Barandella, they were running this London reading group for the Wartime Quartet lecture series at the Royal Institute of Philosophy. And I was getting all books that I could find of these four women's onto my hands. And then I started reading all sorts of things at the same time. And I have to say that at first I didn't quite have the patience for it, or maybe I was a tad too serious at the time for reading it. And I had the sense that I found it a little bit unnerving, or maybe I was occupied with other more pressing issues. I mean, we'll talk about the comic in it. And later on, I had more patience with it, and I have to say that also with the audio version read by, and I noted the name, Samuel West, especially as a non-native speaker, that opened so much for me in terms of accent. That's really lovely. And so I found myself, and I was sometimes listening to it when out on the walks with my dogs, and I found myself laughing out in public, like on Hampstead Heath, standing there and laughing. And so yes, so ultimately I got to enjoy it.
Lucy's a fan of the Sam West reading as well, aren't you?
He has become Jake 𝗏𝗏𝗃 in my head now. When I read the book again for today, I just picture him all the way through it now. He's just perfect.
He is.
Yeah,
I think he absolutely is. Yeah. That's really funny and interesting. Now everybody's going to download the audiobook. Let's start at the beginning. Hannah, perhaps you could help. For those of us who haven't read the book yet, or those of us who, like me, who read it a long time ago and are coming back to it, can you give us a quick dash through the story? Because it begins with our protagonist, Jake, or Sam West, a mooching writer and hack being made homeless.
Yeah, exactly. So the main character is James Donoghue. He is an aspiring writer. He's also the narrator of the story. So we hear it from his perspective, which is, I suppose, why he comes associated with Samuel West, vice versa. So he's living as a translator of a French writer, Jean-Pierre Breteuil, but he basically lives off other people. So it starts indeed with him being thrown out of a house he shared with Madge, and where he lived rent-free with his companion Finn. And the relationship between Jake and Finn is of a very peculiar nature, and we might come to talk to that. So money is of some concern to Jake, but not much. There are always, throughout the novel, people providing him with accommodation and money. And people seem to leave their houses open quite freely, given that they live in the center of London, and not so much care about that. The plot is driven by a quest over a few days of Jake trying to find Hugo Bellfounder. I think that's the main quest. There's some other quests as well, but that's the main quest. And Hugo Bellfounder he met, we learn in one of the earlier chapters, in a medical center, where they're both taking flu. Were subjected to flu trials and were given the flu, and then they were sharing a room, and at one point they started talking. And Jake is very impressed with Hugo. He describes him as a theoretician, I think, but without a master theory. He talks about him as being very objective and detached. And then Jake starts writing the dialogues down, first as an aide-memoire, but later he embellishes them, and he keeps thinking about him. But he says, well, he's never going to publish them. So he sort of entertains in his mind whether he should publish it, what would happen, etc., etc. And I think that's actually a really interesting motive that becomes very important later in Murdoch's Philosopher. And in the end, he shows it to someone, a friend of his, Dave, who's a philosopher, and publication then comes nearer, and it is actually published as a book, The Silencer. And then on the day that it's published, he's bound to meet Hugo, but he doesn't go to their appointed place of meeting on the bridge. Instead, he sits somewhere away from the bridge and watches Hugo as he waits for Jake. Then he knows he's going to his house, and they then never meet. And there's some time disappears. And when we come back to it, when we start the book, Jake has just sort of returned from Paris, and he speaks to Sadie, a friend of them, and then he starts to find Hugo. And so the quest is really find Hugo. there are sort of subplots in doing that. He doesn't find him until very late in the chapter, and then there's a sort of denouement in the book, but then there's sort of a denouement. But in the meantime, there are all sorts of plot twists and comical interventions, some related to the other characters. So there's Finn, who is his Irish sidekick. There's Mrs. Trinken, who's a lady in a corner shop, who's also a holding place for some of his luggage. It's also interesting, he keeps depositing some of his luggage in different houses. There's Dave, the philosopher, very much one of criticism and analysis. There's Lefty, a political activist, and there's Madge and Sadie, the main, so two women, two sisters, who sort of keep going with the plot as well. They're actually part of another subplot where Jake thinks that Hugo loves Anna and Jake loves, and etc., etc. And it turns out in the end that Anna loves Hugo and Hugo loves Sadie and Sadie loves Jake and Jake loves Anna. And there's just some sort of really Shakespearean kind of love drama there.
But he calls it a love diamond, doesn't he, rather than a love triangle?
Yeah. And I think there is another character, which is Mr. Mars, who's an Alsatian, a dog. And I know Mara will talk about him, who gets kidnapped at a certain point. And so you get all these sort of developments where they try to visit the film studio that Hugo has at a certain point, and it's completely destroyed. Mr. Mars is kidnapped. So all these sorts of events, which I'm sure we'll talk about throughout the discussion. I want to add one thing which really struck me this time and didn't strike me before, that I think London is a really important character there. I think it didn't strike me before because, well, as the train ticket in 1999 showed, I was between Nijmegen and Maastricht. I wasn't even in London. And so I think my second reading was in Glasgow. It's not that until this reading I'm reading in London and not being able to visit the center actually, but it struck me how many chapters start with I was in this place in London, I was in that place in London, I moved there, I took this bus, I took that bus. And I think Murdoch had a lot of fun by relating the different places in London to different positions and different ideas. But there's also a sort of tour of Paris, but I think the tour of London is much more extensive.
It's funny you say that because I concur entirely. When I read it again in preparation for this, I'm 20 years older now, and I know that London, but I also know these characters. I know the lefty friend, I know the slightly drunken sidekick, I know the philosophers, I know the wild actress girlfriends, I know this cast, I know the shopkeeper, and so it struck me that there's a really great deftness in her character study of the kinds of people that populate a city. I wonder what the rest of you think about that, what you, Lucy and Mara, think about this idea of it being a London novel.
For me, I mean, that's absolutely at the heart of the appeal for me. I am a Londoner. I used to work on Fleet Street. I've never known anybody be able to conjure the kind of randomly occurring drunken bender like Iris does. All of a sudden they just head off, and before you know it, he doesn't really want to be drinking, but before you know it, he's having his first pint, then another one, then he's onto the whiskies, then they're buying bottles of brandy, then he ends up swimming in the Thames and declaring lifelong political allegiances that are just all completely forgotten the next morning. And so many things that Jake does are done either with a hangover or without much memory of the night before. And also the tours through London, whether it's like at night when Murdoch traces the churches through Paris, she traces the pubs through London. They could go east or west, they could go to the King Lud, or they could head down Fleet Street, and that is just so evocative to me. I think it's brilliant. I mean, that's what I really love about it.
Did you want to add to that,
Mara?
I
just wanted to say precisely what someone in the chat has just posted, that she has that line about some parts of London being necessary and others contingent, which I found very, very fitting. And I believe everyone has different parts of London in these categories, of course. And I mean, at the same time, I agree with you that it's sort of timeless. So it seems as if, and even the debates about Europe, so Dave has this thing that he wants to talk about Europe, and then this is, maybe Europe's not going to be there forever, and you read that today and you feel like, right, okay. It also struck me that the way in which he inhabited this city as a much more homely place, as it might be today for us, might be not so timeless. So, for instance, this thing about Miss Tinkham with the shop, and this being able, and people seem to have so much time on their hands, like they could always, you know, just run off on some drinking spree and have that adventure and whatnot. So maybe that was more her experience, or we're just a little busier today in London.
I think London is busier as well. I mean, those scenes where they're standing on Holborn Viaduct and looking, and there's completely deathly silence either side of them. I don't think you get that at any hour of the night.
Yeah. I was thinking how it's the novel is about a certain kind of transience, the people who move through a city, but London feels even more transient, or the inhabitants of London feel even more transient, that we move through it quicker and quicker, and we don't have the time to forge the kinds of relationships that Jake does. So Mara, you were going to say something?
Just going to add this very old-fashioned institution of a telephone book. We're just asking people on the odd chance that they would know where someone else is. I mean, these days we have WhatsApp or Telegram or whatever you want to use, and so it came a bit as a relief from our age, maybe, reading this today.
Yeah. Mara, can we talk about the tone of the book? I think you're getting at it, and we've talked about the kind of light comedy, but also the philosophical stakes in it. Tell me about the tone of this book.
As I said, I found myself laughing out loud quite often, and that has something to do with something very British, I suppose, a sort of self-deprecation, understatement, but it becomes so humorous in Jake because he's not at all like that. He's very self-concerned, and he takes himself very, very serious, but in the wrong way, speaking from Murdoch's perspective as a philosopher. So he's egotistic on end, and the way in which she allows him to run into his own paradoxes almost is very amusing. But at the same time, I do think that there's great seriousness in some characters, and I would say these are in particular Hugo and Anna. And I was wondering how much of the more serious philosophical thoughts Murdoch had placed within these two characters in particular. Maybe we could talk a bit about that as well. The one worry I had, I mean, this novel is just very funny and witty, and it goes at a very high speed. And sometimes I had the impression that maybe I suppose that was her first novel, and coming out of academia, being already rather successful at that. Some people always say, well, Murdoch became successful as a philosopher later on in odd ways, but that's not true, because if you look at her published writing, she's got very good publications early on, and then she just finds it in her talents to write a novel and become successful at that. And the one thing I worry about the philosophical content of the novel is that it gets lost in the speed and the comedy. Of course, you can always go back and read it again, but then that was my impression, that maybe she's on some of the issues too lighthearted. But I mean, as I said, it's a beautiful character study. There's a lot of British humor, and I suppose I'm not even getting all of it. But that's the tone that I appreciate.
Yeah, I agree. When I read it again, I thought that there were moments where she's so caught up in this world and these characters and their japes, their escapades, that when they pause to have what feels almost like quite a self-consciously philosophical, reflective moment on how they're expressing themselves, whether they're being understood, what people intend, those moments pass very quickly, because then she must pick up the plot again.
But I don't think that's necessarily...
Go, Lucy.
That's not necessarily the philosophical content of the novel, though. I think, as with many of Murdoch's writings, there were the overt mentions, like the gentle refutation of Berkeley, which is to fountain and things like this, because I love that line when she talks about the fountains are brilliant because they can be heard even when there's nobody there. So there's kind of little philosophical points, little not jokes exactly, but little kind of knowing references. And of course, Murdoch always said, well, she writes about philosophy because philosophy is what she knows. So I think she says something like, if I knew about sailing boats, I'd write about sailing boats. So the milieu of her novels is often either a philosophical world or contains philosophers, and their language and their jokes and their frames of reference, they are philosophically informed. But I think what I love about Under the Net, and to be honest, the more I talk about Jake, I actually find it quite hard not to laugh because he's so preposterous. The way in which he suddenly decides the way to deal with the situation is to do a judo throw.
Isn't that weird? Yes.
Judo. Or he suddenly decides that for some reason he can't go and visit Hugo in hospital during the day, so he's got to break in overnight, thereby losing his job and ruining it. The way in which he just goes off without thinking for the worst possible idea creates a whole environment across the whole novel of him kind of blundering from one thing to another, making wrong decisions about people, because he completely lacks any kind of ability to pause, reflect, and really look, which is what Murdoch's asking us to do. So I think, in a way, the whole novel illustrates quite brilliantly Jake's move, not completed move, but beginning to move from self-obsessed blindness to anyone else having any kind of universe, to beginning to see that other people are not him.
I agree, but can I ask you a question, because you're obviously much more knowledgeable about that than me. But for instance, in his conversation with Anna or with Hugo or even with Dave, there are often these little ideas that I found resonate with Murdoch's philosophical project. The let's say uselessness of abstraction, the longing to get away from language in one way or another, the seeing element, and all of that, and that's sort of teased, and then everyone is rushed on to the next scene. And I agree that it's replicated at the level of the whole plot, because that's the development that we see in Jake, that ultimately he'll become, slowly but surely and painfully for him, someone who pauses to see, but yet maybe I was just so taken by the laughter that sometimes
I'm with you, actually, Mara. I'm with you. I think she doesn't ever. I think this is for more novels, but I think this novel in particular, she moves on for the laugh quite quickly, and I think that's characteristic of this. And I was thinking about, I know we're not talking about other novels until yet, but I'll say one thing.
You can, of course you can.
I think in this novel, people are less connected by necessity. So I think in later novels, you get all these characters who are much more bound by the situation they're in, and sort of struck by that and struck down by that, right? So if you think about even The Flight from the Enchanter, there's a refugee who in the end doesn't see any way out and commits suicide. And you get more this idea of characters being bound by who they are and then being able to get out of that yes or no. And I think here there's more of a light tone, and there's less of that being bound by circumstances. And I think the sort of way in which money floats to Jake in this case, right? And to be honest, I think of this as London quite the old times, because perhaps I am too obsessed as a Londoner, but I think house prices and all that sort of thing. But I think, his money just floats, he just walks around, it's all quite lighthearted in that sense. But I think even in later novels, Murdoch sometimes seems to shy away from the real evil in order to make a joke. I think she really likes making jokes.
Yeah, we should talk about that a bit more, I think, in a moment. But I want to get a little bit of the novel into our book group. So Lucy, I'm going to come to you. Each of you have been asked to select a passage, and you've selected a passage that might help us to think about the relationship between Jake and Hugo. Do you want to introduce it and read it, or do you want to talk about it?
Okay. The reason why I chose this passage is because I think it goes right to the heart of what we're talking about, in that so Hugo and Jake have met in this Centre for Cold Cure, which makes it even more present for now as well. I could see it clearly needs to be, this is the time to be looking at this book. And Jake is very impressed by Hugo, as Hannah said, but what impressed him is that he's a truth teller. He's searching for the truth, particular truths about how to understand reality exactly as it is, rather than using any kind of totalizing theory or any kind of grand claim about life. So yes, he likes theories, but there is no one big totalizing theory, and that's what strikes Jake about it. And so he writes up his conversations with Hugo and embellishes them. And the reason why I like this passage is because it expresses right away how Jake has no idea what Hugo might think of it, or in fact what he's the amount of work that he's actually doing to it. So he's beginning to show his manuscript to people. He says, since I knew how much the whole project would displease him, meaning Hugo, I had felt myself bound to conceal Hugo's identity. I presented the thing to Dave as a dramatic exercise, rather remotely based on conversations which I had had with a variety of people. But now, in a little while, I found myself being regarded in certain circles as a kind of sage, and many of my friends pressed me to let them see the manuscript. Eventually, I did show it to a few more people and began to get used to the idea that it should circulate a little. All this time, I was still working on it and drawing additional matter from my current conversations with Hugo. I had continued to keep my friendship with Hugo completely secret from all my other friends. I did this at first out of a jealous desire to keep my remarkable find to myself, and later on also because I feared that Hugo might discover my treachery. People were now constantly suggesting to me that I should publish the thing, at which I just laughed. But the notion was attractive to me all the same. It was attractive at first in the way something can attract one when one knows one will never do it. As publication was so absolutely out of the question, I felt it was quite safe to broach upon it in imagination. I thought what a remarkable book it would make, how original, how astonishing, how illuminating. I amused myself inventing titles for it. I would sit holding the manuscript in my hands and then I would fancy it reproduced 1,000-fold. I suffered continually at that time from a fear of losing the manuscript, and although I typed out 2 or 3 copies, I still felt it very likely that somehow or other they would all be destroyed and the thing lost forever, which I couldn't help thinking would be a pity. Then one day a publisher approached me directly with a proposal for its publication. This took me by surprise. I had never been spontaneously approached by a publisher before, and such condescension rather turned my head. It occurred to me that if this book were a success, which I couldn't doubt, this might smooth my way considerably in the literary world. It's easier to sell junk when you're known than works of genius when you're unknown. If I could leap to fame in this way, my career as a writer would be made. I set this idea aside, telling myself that the project was an impossible one. I couldn't palm off Hugo's ideas as my own. Most of all, I couldn't use material drawn from my intimacy with Hugo to present the public with a work which would fill Hugo himself with repulsion and disgust. But the idle dreams of publication, which I had nourished earlier, now unmasked themselves as a real will. I became obsessed with the notion that I would publish. A sort of fatality drew me towards it. I saw all my past acts as leading inevitably to this end. I remember a drunken evening during which I passed in fantasy through every stage of the process, which should bring the dialogue into print. By then, the idea had too great a reality in imagination for it to be long before it should become actual. I rang up the publisher at his home. He knew of my reluctances and arrived early the next morning with the contract, which I signed with a flourish of abandon and a splitting headache. After he had gone, I took up the manuscript and looked at it as one looks at the woman for whom one has lost one's honour. I entitled it The Silencer and added an author's preface to the effect that I owed many of the ideas contained therein to a friend who should be nameless, but that I had no reason to believe that he would approve of the form in which I was presenting them. Then I sent the thing away and left it to its fate.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I want to carry on reading now. I was gonna ask about Jake and Hugo. Well, let me ask you. As you were reading, I was thinking, when a writer writes about another writer or imagines another writer writing, that reflexivity, it's almost invariable, isn't it, that they're also talking about their own practice? Is that right here?
What, you mean that Jake is talking about his own? Yeah.
Or Murdoch is writing, maybe.
Murdoch is. Oh,
yeah. Okay. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, just as I was reading it then for the first time, I thought of the way in which her husband, John Bailey, in her last years would write about her and about their intimate lives whilst she was still alive and actually sitting in another room.
Yeah.
And so in a way, that kind of presages that quite.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what I think is so fascinating about this is that Hugo has revealed in the conversations with Jake that he's not actually that interested, he's not interested in language. He thinks language is inadequate to describe the reality of things. And so consequently, Jake calls this book the silencer in a way, because Hugo is silencing language. But what does Hugo turn to do? He goes and becomes a filmmaker, which is where I love the book. He, rather than writing himself, he goes and becomes a maker of films in an attempt to get to the reality of things. So this is where I see it really pivotal. Mara's waving.
Yeah, Mara, come on in.
Yeah, I'm just curious because later on, when Jake and Hugo get to meet again, and Jake confesses how he was written about all these doubts about the quality of his work and what he had done to Hugo's thoughts in the novel and whatnot, Hugo then says, "You've made something wonderful, much better than I ever had in mind out of it," right? And so it seems to me that Hugo is actually not so preoccupied by all the important theorizing that he's putting out there. He's just putting it out there, and Jakes takes it incredibly seriously and goes into that frenzy, destroys a friendship for that, which is really a horrible situation.
He thinks he has destroyed a friendship. He hasn't actually.
Well, he has in a way, because I mean they don't meet for I don't know for how many years, and the situation when he keeps Hugo waiting on the bridge, and when he knows where he's going, his friend is seeking him out, and he's just sort of incapable of making this very normal and human move. That's so disappointing in a way. And then later on Hugo says, "I forgive you," or not even "I forgive you." It's just it's a bit sad that we didn't get to share more time. And by the way, your book is great. It's much greater than what I had in mind.
I can't believe it. He also knows that Hugo is a very humble person.
Yeah.
So his perception of Hugo as taking great offence to this is completely wrong-headed.
Yes.
Hugo's not like that at all.
Yeah.
Go on, Hannah, I was going to draw you in. Here you are.
Yeah, this shows, I mean, that the book is about Jake and it's not about Hugo, right? And I think what interests me in the passage you read, I was forgotten, it's in this passage where he's entertaining the thought because he thinks it's an innocent thought to have. And so a year before this, Murdoch publishes Sartre Romantic Rationalist, in which he says of Sartre, even he thinks that when we make a decision, the die is already cast.
Yeah.
And so you see that here as a motive, like our imaginations, our musings, they're not innocent. And it becomes a big thing later in The Sovereignty of Good. But I think here she shows it, as the philosophy comes in, this shows it quite nicely, this idea that, you can think things through, but then suddenly you're already there at the decision.
You're prepared. The ground is already laid.
Yeah.
Do you think the fact that he's a translator of somebody else's work is part of that laying the groundwork for him to be happy to? He's got a rather parasitic quality about him, as you said. He's always living off other people, whether it's Madge and using Finn's goodwill, trying to use Dave, trying to use Anna. Do you think that he's doing that with Hugo's work as well? That's consistent with his kind of not actually getting on and writing himself or committing himself or making a go of his life himself?
I'm not sure translation is parasitic, actually.
Bolton Benjamin would protest. Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's even in this novel, parasitic. But there is something about, I think it's more about how he can't have others in his life, right? So this relationship, he's living partly on the translation, but he's also very envious. And again, not seeing what the author is doing, because when he goes to Paris, he's suddenly surprised that this man gets the great French prize.
Sorry, Hannah, I want to pick up on, you mentioned Sartre a moment ago. When I was looking up the dates for this book, this is written in 1954, and Nausea, I think, is 1938,
36.
and 36, and Camus is writing L'Étranger in 1942. So, I mean, one of the questions that's on my mind is the philosophical novel a genre here, and is she writing a philosophical novel in that order, or is she doing something different? Is she writing a novel that happens to be philosophical, or is it philosophy disguised as a novel? Tell me about the philosophical mode of this book.
We mentioned reception earlier, and in fact this novel was perceived when it came out as one of the kind of angry young men novels. Right. So I think perhaps a lot of what she was trying to do wasn't perceived as a radically philosophical novel.
Yeah. Hannah, what do you think? Because I know you've got a reading lined up for us as well.
Yeah, I'm not so sure whether this is a philosophical novel, but it depends very much what you think a philosophical novel is, I assume. So it is a philosophical novel in the sense that I mean, there are various references to philosophy. I think Murdoch is a bit disingenuous in the interview with McGee when she says, "Oh, it just happens to come into my novel." I think she's playing a bit for the audience there. Sartre comes into it a couple of times. Like, there are absolutely clear references to Sartre, like somebody having their hand lay without it sort of being attached to them, and the song at the end. Again, I'm not so sure how important we think them. I think sometimes she's just joking and making that reference, but certainly not understanding it exactly the same. I think for the song in the end, there's something very interesting to say. Not my passage. I'll read you my passage, which comes from, if one has a book with them, comes from chapter 2, the third paragraph. I don't want to give page numbers because there's so many different editions. I really like this paragraph because it sort of shows Murdoch deeply steeped in philosophical academic circles. It also shows her humor, and it shows a bit of what she thinks philosophy can and cannot do. So this is how it starts. Dave, so this is Dave, the philosopher, does extramural work for the university and collects about him many youth who have a part-time interest in truth. Dave's pupils adore him, but there is a permanent fight on between him and them. They aspire like sunflowers. They are all natural metaphysicians, or so Dave says in a tone of disgust. This seems to me to be a wonderful thing to be, but inspires in Dave a passion of opposition. To Dave's pupils, the world is a mystery to which it should be reasonably possible to discover a key. The key would be something of the sort that could be contained in a book of some 800 pages. To find the key would not necessarily be a simple matter, but Dave's pupils feel sure that the dedication of between 4 and 10 hours a week, excluding university vacations, should suffice to find it. They do not conceive that the matter should be either more simple or more complex than that. They are prepared with certain limits to alter their views. Many of them arrive as theosophists and depart as critical realists or Bradleyans. It's remarkable how Dave's criticism seems so often to be purely catalytic in its action. He blazes upon them with the destructive fury of the sun, but instead of shriveling up their metaphysical pretensions, achieves merely their metamorphosis from one rich state into another. His curious facts makes me think that perhaps after all Dave is, in spite of himself, a good teacher. Occasionally he succeeds in converting some peculiarly receptive youth to his own brand of linguistic analysis, after which as often as not the youth loses interest in philosophy altogether. To watch Dave at work on these young men is like watching someone prune a rose bush. It is all the strongest and most luxuriant shoots which have to come off. And later perhaps there will be blossoms, but not philosophical ones, Dave trusts. His great aim is to dissuade the young from philosophy. He always warns me of it with particular earnestness.
Thank you. I love that because we're teachers, of course. And why did you choose it?
I like it because I think it shows Murdoch's great comical tone. I think that's very funny. I also think it shows her sort of reserve for certain ways of doing philosophy. So after that, you get these very comical situations in which people pass the tea, but also say, but is ought and ought and is, and that sort of conversations, which again is quite funny. And so I think it very characterizes Murdoch's fun when she writes. It also shows a bit her reluctance to engage in philosophy, I think. So the writing at this time, she often poses herself as a non-philosopher. It's rather interesting. She often says, well, what do we do? Philosophers say this, but what do we do when we speak as normal people? Or she brings in, later on she brings in virtuous peasants, a problematic concept, but again, right, you see this sort of opposition to philosophy. And I like that. And so and of course it also shows, I think, her own experience of not having been taught by Wittgenstein. I think she has 2 lessons, and he said having 2 lessons, philosophy is like 2 piano lessons, no use whatsoever. But to have lived with Wittgenstein's pupils. And I think this is really inspired by that. So it's a character sketch, I think,
Yeah.
of that period, but it also shows a bit what she thinks about philosophy.
Yeah.
And then her own interest. I think truth is an important interest in this novel all the way through, and clarity and muddle. I think those are really important concepts. So she's really worried when things get too clear. And I love this when she says they should find a solution in 10 weeks of term for age, that sort of thing. I think she's very funny, but she's very suspicious of too much clarity. And that shows in this passage as well. And later on in the novel, there is, and then the others can respond. There's a wonderful passage in Fairly Honourable Defeat, where she says of the main character, somebody says of him, of the main good character, when 𝗤𝘂𝗃 is there, there's always a muddle, and then they turn it around and say it's not fair. When there's a muddle, 𝗃𝘃 is there. So to have clarity is for her almost morally dubious.
Yeah. Mara, you were nodding along to that. Did you want to say something?
No, I'm just curious about the model she might have had in mind for Dave, because I think some people would say, well, it's Wittgenstein in one way or another, but I don't think that she really intends to point into his direction, because she makes Dave a German Jewish immigrant, right? I mean, of course, Wittgenstein has his own history and luggage, if you like, but it seemed to me that from that perspective, you might I don't know, get another sense of the gravitas that is behind Dave's, and the reluctance with which some of the people who were doing this very abstract moral theorizing at the time approached the project of moral philosophy. And we know the debates between these women like Murdoch and her friends and the philosophy of their time, and how they found it sort of morally problematic to do that kind of theory that they were doing. But then sometimes you could also see that someone who might have spent some time in a prisoner of war camp or whatnot really tries to work hard at the rationality of it all in order to, make some sense of the world after all. So I was wondering, Hannah, you surely know whom she had in mind with when she came up with Dave, and how much, or maybe, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but
I'm also a bit reluctant to attribute too clearly between this is reality and this is the person that she has in mind, because I think she has an enormous creative person. I think there is some of Wittgenstein in this, right? In the sense that the dissuasion from philosophy, which I think relates back to Wittgenstein. There are other elements of this complete analysis and questioning. I mean, Hugo has some characteristics of Wittgenstein as well, but I think Dave as well. I think it's interesting to talk about his Jewish background. He might also be a model for one of her other teachers that she had in Oxford. And of course, it makes a difference whether they came before the war or after the war. But I think most of her refugee characters, if they're Jewish, come before the war.
I was going to ask whether the novel has been engaged with as a philosophical text by other philosophers.
Not so much. Well, see, this is the interesting part. So I wrote my PhD 16 years ago, and then so I did not do it in a philosophy department. I was in an interdisciplinary institute, and then my supervisor, who was not a philosopher, either one of them, thought it was funny to ask visiting philosophers what they thought of my project, and most of them said, it's crap, Murdoch's not a philosopher, right? And he thought that was funny, and I thought that was funny. And now suddenly she's all interesting, but I think philosophers are catching up.
Yeah. What accounts for that, Lucy?
Accounts for the catching up?
Yeah. I feel like there has been, I mean, not least because of the anniversary last year, but...
I think it's been staged, actually, as in stages. I think there was a flurry of interest around the time of her death, and around the time of the release of the memoirs by her husband John Bailey, and the film by Richard Eyre, featuring Judi Dench and Kate Winslet as the younger and older Murdoch, Oscar nominated, very highly regarded film. But it was a film about, it wasn't a film about Iris Murdoch, the writer, or the working woman, the middle-aged woman. It was a film about the young, creative, forceful character, or the older, very unwell one. And so I think on the back of that, there began to be a resurgence also in, well, what was this woman's work actually about? Certainly more and more philosophy conferences began at Oxford. I went to one after another, and there began to be, there was a big AHRC grant to set up the Centre for Iris Murdoch Studies at the University of Kingston, and various scholars started working on acquiring her correspondence with other philosophers like Philippa Furton, with Bridget Brophy, and with 𝗏, and who influenced this novel. So more work grew, but I do think it sprung from that, from an initial interest in her as a woman, and what happened to her. But she did kind of become the poster girl for Alzheimer's for quite a long time, and I think that's not the case now. I think that her novels, and there's a growing interest in her novels as well in terms of adaptations and things like that, but in terms of her philosophy, there's a certain, and also there's so much in her philosophical work to do with the environment, to do with animals, to do with morality and goodness and question, that are far more in vogue as concepts now. So what's really interesting about the passage Hannah read that struck me was her use of the roses, like cutting off the roses as in the most beautiful, the most, you know, she was interested in art, she was interested in nature, such a rich writer and thinker that I think the more her work is read, it's exponential.
Yeah.
You know, it's building and building.
We're helping towards that as well, I think.
Yeah.
Mara, let's get one last reading in, and this is one that you've selected, and then we'll open up to questions.
Yes, may I spontaneously pick another one, because
yes, of
we've
course,
said quite a bit about Jake now. So Mark, just to introduce what I think is the most important character.
We've overlooked someone very important.
The Alsatian. So he is a film star himself. So he's a dog known from various movies. And Jake decides to kidnap this poor creature because the person who owns him presently has stolen his manuscript, and he's now hoping to be able to get the manuscript back or get royalties from the film that this other person is hoping to produce, Sammy. And so they have been already on a journey together, and we found, and I think it's remarkable how Mars initiates a change in character in Jake. And that's consistent with Murdoch's idea that if we turn to nature, if we turn to animals, if we turn to art, if we turn to anything that is sort of transcends ourselves and reminds us of the fact that things other than ourselves are real, and attend to them lovingly, that we sort of improve. And so they've done a little bit of this already, but Jake is not yet there. And so now he is back, and his life hasn't gone too well, and Mars is with him in the room, and I'm going to read you that section.
Thank you.
So Mars was somewhere in the room. He would lie so silent for long periods that I would think that perhaps he had gone away, and start looking for him with my eyes, only to find him lying close to me and looking at me. Occasionally, he would attempt to lie on the bed beside me, but I discouraged this. His warm fur had an aroma of sleep which made me afraid. Then he would stretch out near me on the floor, and for a time I would dangle my hand upon his neck. Later on, he would poke about the room in a bored way until he threw himself down in a far corner with a grunting sound. Later on again, I would hear his claws click on the linoleum, and he would come and thrust his long nose into my face and give me a long look of anguish which came so near to transcending his nature that I would push his face away and ruffle up the fur of his back to satisfy myself that he was only a dog. So, and I think what this shows very nicely is the way in which Jake starts looking lovingly at this other creature, and the importance the dog has for him, because in the beginning, he is looking at Mars from a purely instrumental perspective. At some point, he even considers that his ears would make nice silk purses, which is ridiculous. And then all the time, you've got the dog who's an exemplar of virtue. He's loyal, he's loving, he's patient, he's courageous. He sticks with Jake through thick and thin at the studio with the fight and everything, and he is miming along and saving Jake. And And here Jake is, and this is shortly before something very important happens in Jake's life. Namely, he takes up a, let's say, proper job, right? And the dog is there. And so I just wanted to talk about this because, as I said, that mirrors some of the things that we find in Murdoch's philosophy as well.
Yeah.
And that is, as Lucy just said, then gaining more interest in the broader philosophical circles, and lots of work is being done on how this idea of really looking and appreciating from a non-anthropocentric perspective, yet not taking humans completely out of the equation either, might help us improving, really.
I love that reading. It's really transformed my sense of the book. Your affection for Mr. Mars, as a dog owner, I know you are too, has really enriched that for me. We will pick up the conversation, but let me turn to the audience because they've been sitting very patiently waiting for us, and there are a number of questions in the chat, and I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. There was one from Shrindi Prakash, and I'll read it to you. It's towards the top. It came in at 6:15. I'm not too familiar with Murdoch, being still partway through the 𝗟𝗔. Is this plot of tracking down or running into an important character from one's past a recurring theme in Murdoch's work? So tracking down or running into an important character, is it a theme? Or yeah.
Recurring, it certainly is. So there's often at the start of a Murdoch novel somebody who comes back from the past to haunt them or to rearrange everything. I think Richard Todd compares Murdoch's novels to what's the English word? Like a hot pressure pot, where like things are thrown in together. There's lots of things change, and then people come out, sometimes better, sometimes not. I don't think it's always that obvious that people actually have improved. They might be slightly more doubtful, less certain, but if they have improved, I'm not always sure. I won't say anything about the 𝗟𝗔, but read on. So in that sense, yes, there is.
Yeah. Let me get to Alex Leggett's question, 6:17. Hi, I'm studying for an MPhil at Cambridge. Good luck, Alex. And my dissertation is on Murdoch. Wonderful. Murdoch, mysticism and the limits of language. I was wondering if anyone could comment on Murdoch's engagement with mysticism and Wittgensteinian theories of language, specifically with reference to the dialogue, the silencer, and her wider philosophy in metaphysics. That sounds like one for Hannah.
This is for you. I think so Wittgenstein is not my specialism, but the mysticism comes in metaphysics as a guide to morals very much. And I think it's inspired by her reading of Plato, by the reading of Plato's Cave, but it's also inspired by St. John of the Cross. Say again?
Yeah. Simone Weil, yeah.
Okay, of course, yeah.
Less of a not a kind of religious mysticism though, like Weil, but a kind of that Neoplatonic concern with the transcendent good, theological, but that is transcendent, and that we all are kind of orientated towards it.
Yeah, it has to happen in ordinary circumstances, in quite run-down circumstances, when you're down and out, like a Jake, I think.
Yeah.
How religious she is, though, I think is a matter of debate. So I think she becomes more interested in religion later. Like, I think she has a real interest in, but not a real interest in religion as something of a community, of a certain tradition. Though it's very clear that she is raised in a Christian tradition. Mm-hmm. But I think she becomes more and more interested in it later on. Like in Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, she said, angels and I think even Christ appears in the later novels.
As long as you don't think of him as a deity, but like she's a great fan of prayer as well, isn't she? Because she sees prayer as a meditative endeavor that's focusing on something other than oneself. So provided it's not a kind of petition type prayer where you're asking for something for yourself, she sees that kind of exercise as something valuable.
And she's keenly interested in ritual, and actually that's back in this novel as well, right? So when they go swimming, she calls it a ritual performed, and it's rather an interesting passage. I won't read it.
Tell me about the swimming, because you think the swimming is a very important thematic element to this book.
So I did a podcast on Murdoch and swimming. It was a fun podcast this summer, and so I read some of the passages of swimming in Murdoch's novels. I think Peter Conradi says you could read all the novels through swimming, and I think that's a great idea. Here, the swimming So it happens. I think it's interesting because it's an extremely embodied experience, and she talks about it in rather embodied terms. And anyone who has gone into the cold water knows that you sort of reduce to your body, right? The more you're into October, the further you are. And so it sort of happens that this seems to be, for me, this is my thesis, my next paper, an idea of unselfing, because you sort of become more yourself, and yet you become sort of more aware of the rest of your surroundings. And that's what happens to Jake. Like, he becomes less obsessed with himself and more concerned for his surroundings. And how she writes about it, she uses a lot of religious language. So she talks about a ritual, but she also seems to have a sort of breaking of bread afterwards and drinking of wine. It's brandy and it's pâté and it's crackers, but I think there is a sort of similarity there. And I think she really likes the idea of ritual in a sort of abstract sense, and it gets a bit more flesh in the novels, and this, I think, is one of those occasions.
She says something about the stories about at Christmas. She says, the stories of baby being born in a stable with donkeys and asses is a good story. She said they're good to have in our lives.
Yeah. Mara, you were nodding along. What did you want to say, Mara?
Can I just ask you, Hannah, because so I think that's a very interesting idea, that in the exercise of swimming has something to do with unselfing. And there is that passage when he's in Paris where Jake comments sort of offhand about these weird people who encourage their dogs to go swimming and who enjoy to see their dogs swimming that much. Do you think that's an attempt of communion with the other animals in the water? Or I don't know. So
I'm not that keen on the dog.
Oh no, I am now, Mara. You really sold Mr. Mars to me. I feel like he's a much overlooked character. Let me pick up one of the other questions. There was a kind of exchange between Jenny Judge and John Spratlin. They were touching on things that we were talking about, and Jenny quoted very knowledgeably. Henry James famously said of George Eliot that Murdoch's prose sometimes smells of the lamp. I love Murdoch, but I sometimes feel a bit frustrated by the way the philosophical content feels a bit shoehorned in. And then Jacqueline responded saying, I quite like the philosophy being incidental. Is the novel a vehicle for the philosophy or an alternative to it? And we sort of roamed around those questions, but have you made your decisions? Is the philosophical content shoehorned in? Is the novel a vehicle for the philosophy or an alternative to it? Where do you stand on that?
Complex picture, actually, because I know when I started studying her philosophical works in relation to film, several people said to me, you have to include the novels, because so much of her philosophy is in the novels. You can't just read the philosophical text. And I absolutely didn't want to do that, because I thought, if I want to see the philosophy standing on its own and not worked out. So I think it's sometimes perceived that her novels are almost like supplementary scenarios for her to work through her philosophical worldviews. And there's no doubt about it that does happen. But at the same time, I don't think she's being disingenuous when she says that some of her language and examples and characters are taken from what she knows, and that they are not necessarily meaning to bash her over the head with philosophical references, even though in fact it might read a bit like that sometimes. And I have some sympathy with that, because sometimes I think, all right, Iris, we know you believe in attention and close attention, does everybody have to do it all the time? So I get that, and it does feature highly in the novels, but I'm not sure. I don't think that she would be very opposed to the idea that she used novels as a way to write philosophically. She thought that was a big mistake.
Mara?
Yeah, and I just think that clearly she would know that these are two different ways in which the mind operates, and she knows how to do philosophy, and she knows how to write a novel or to write poetry or whatever, and I don't think that she's I don't know, but it would strike me as strange as if she was just replacing the one by the other.
Hannah?
I think I started out only reading her philosophy, but I'm more and more keen to include the novels when I think about her work. So I see more and more a connection. I also see her sort of reflecting on her philosophy in her novels. I think there's a sort of going back and forth between the two. So the activity of novel writing, which is important in Under the Net, she reflects on that in her philosophical writing, and I think some of her philosophical ideas she tries out in some of her novels. I think she's just scared of a one-on-one reading, and that's why she is making that distinction so sharply. She's making it more sharply than it's there. I think, you know, one feeds off the other, but to make it to that one-dimensional, I think that's her real worry. And I mean, the novels are not just philosophy; they're great reads as well. And I think her psychology is fantastic, and you know, there are all sorts of fantastic things happening.
Novels are often described as psychology, actually, aren't they? Kind of moral psychology.
Yeah.
But they're actually more about how people work.
I love that category. I think that's a really useful one. There's a terrific question from 𝗟𝘂𝗰𝗆. Seems that Murdoch's loving attention, and you mentioned attention a moment ago, Lucy, is a philosophical concept that has slowly been gaining traction among academic philosophers since the 1980s. What other Murdochian concepts do you think philosophers should look harder at? Lucy, I wonder maybe you could pass that, explain what loving attention means for those of us who don't know.
That is a great question.
Yeah.
So yeah, loving attention is the term that she always says she borrowed in 𝗟𝗏𝗔 of Good. She says, I borrow this from 𝗠𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗀. It's the idea, and the example she gives famously in the 𝗟𝗏𝗔 of Good is that of someone who is sitting in their room at their desk, caught up with their own injured pride and conceit and worrying about something. And they look out of the window and they see a hovering kestrel. And this hovering kestrel takes them out of themselves. And in that moment, they're not thinking about themselves. They're not thinking about their injured pride or their vanity. They're thinking there's nothing going on other than their attention on that kestrel. And for Murdoch, she would say that the idea of unselfing, getting outside of our fat, relentless egos, as she calls them, and being able to cultivate that a just and loving gaze upon something other than ourselves, by paying attention to something other than ourselves, is a way of essentially improving our moral character, doing good moral work, and that also that object or what attracts our attention can be art, nature, another person. And she goes so far as to say that in terms of love, love is to actually understand love, you need to understand that something other than yourself is real. So for her, it's which is what Jake, I think, comes to understand in Under the Net. So I think loving attention is the fundamental concept that I associate with 𝗟𝗏𝗔 of Good and with Murdoch's philosophical thinking.
I love that, Lucy. That's such a wonderful way to read that.
I think what's really important about that is that it's something to cultivate and it's something to work at, rather than a state that is attained. So you don't you don't attain a state, you don't live in a state of attention to somebody else and are thereafter a good person and happy forevermore, but that by learning to pay attention to another, by learning to unself, by learning to not just care practically and do things for another, but actually to alter one's vision and see differently, see another differently, that is the key towards becoming a better person. And I think that's what we see running throughout. It's triggered by Mr. Mars for Jake, and that passage that you read, Mara, let's not forget that occurs when Jake is absolutely in the depths of despond. He is catatonically depressed. He can't get off his hideous camp bed, and in a way it's the love and attention of the gaze of the dog on him helps him to get a bit of confidence. There's that brilliant line where he says something about the smallest creature that can gaze at you as a spider.
Spider, yeah.
The awareness of the gaze of the other on you as well. And so through that, I think through the coming to receive the gaze of Mr. Mars and learn to think about him and love him as well, he begins to realise that actually it can be a good thing to help other people. And he goes and gets a job in the hospital, and then he begins to see Anna at a distance and begins to learn that actually she's not what he thought she was, and that he realises that he's wrong about things, and that other people have their own lives and perspectives on him and the world.
Were there any other philosophical concepts other concepts in the novels that philosophers should attend to, just to pick up again on that question? Do you think, Hannah and Mara?
Well, I think the one I think of is sort of related to love. I think imagination is she writes very interesting about imagination, but I think what she does interesting with love and attention as well is and that's been picked up recently only, I think, is in relation to ecology. And I think she's very interesting there, because sometimes the discussion there is a bit about abstention, right? We shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that. And that just leaves us in different worlds. And I think this notion of love and attention allows for a relationship with nature that's other than one of utility or simply abstention. And I think in that sense, she's a very rich thinker.
Yeah. Mara?
No, and I just want to say, I mean, Hannah, if you don't care so much for the dog, there are the cats. The cats.
I like cats.
And this wonder of the world ending. I mean, this is what the novel ends on. Look, there are these wondrous things in the world, and in this case, it's heteroparental superfecundity. So the opportunity to receive the offspring of two different fathers in the case of the cat, right? But I also found that very interesting as an analogy for how to, you know, come up with a more wondrous view of the world, or appreciation that sometimes very odd things can go together. And I think that's something that we can take away from Murdoch as well. And then, of course, the scene with the chameleon in Paris is to add to this point that Hannah was making about the more than human world and orientation.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I'm going to take one last question from the audience, and this is Pedro Victori. And he says, I'm assuming I remember reading in a prologue to this novel that Under the Net is the story of how Jake matures as a person and an artist and becomes the author of Under the Net. What parts of the adventures Jake lives through this book do have the greatest impact on who he becomes as a novelist? And I think the more interesting question, and what traits, if any, do Jake and Murdoch share as authors? Is that a question we could answer?
I think there is the one thing, the obsession with truth and with lying and the obsession with writing the perfect novel. I think there's something in that. That seems to be a theme through Murdoch's novels as well, right? So where she has this sort of the big bulky novel versus the pure novel that will answer all questions and is perfection.
I mean, I think she must have quite good knowledge of quite a lot of the things that Jake gets up to, because she writes them very evocatively and
the drinking.
Oh yeah.
So I think there's a real obviously her imagination's amazing, but there's a lot of retelling from experience there, I should think, in terms of her character's experience.
Oh, well, Bob Stern very quickly has snuck in a question. Not sure anyone has explained the title of the book. Does anyone want to have a go?
It's to do with the what we were talking about being constrained by language and constrained by theory and grand theory. I think, Hannah, really it's a Wittgensteinian reference, isn't it, about the net of language?
Yeah.
But the idea that if you could, some people seek to cover everything in a net that explains the world and that it accounts for everything, but in fact none of that is applicable to reality and the particularity of reality, and we're all trying to get under that net to see what actually the real world is about, and in its particularity, what the kittens are about, how the kittens are, and not even to understand it, just to see it and appreciate it, free of the net that seeks to cover everything.
Yeah, it does come from I can't pronounce that name, but it's Hugo in the dialogue, right, where he says, like, however hard we may try, as it were, to crawl under the net.
Yeah, she mentions it in there.
But if the silencer is Hugo, and that's the name for the novel that Jake has written, then Hugo again is giving the title for Murdoch's novel.
Yes, yeah. Just to close, if this novel has piqued your interest, what should people read next? Hannah, you go first. What should we read next?
Well, I really like The Bell, and I think if you want to know more about swimming as a way of reading a novel, then The Bell is your novel.
I love that Murdoch invented wild swimming before wild swimming became a thing, it seems like. Yeah.
But everyone was wild swimming. We were just swimming. It's only now that we're wild swimming.
So The Bell. And Lucy?
So it depends on your mood. If you want, if you wanted more jolly Murdoch, I think The Sea is extremely hilarious in places, but also quite crazy and mystical and moving, and about the quest and people from the past and about women. But I also love The Unicorn, if you fancy something really kind of gothic and a bit unique, I think. And Sandcastle is quite beautiful.
Oh, lots to get on with. Mara, something with more dogs and cats in.
Yeah, actually, I understood your final question to ask. So, what am I going to read next from her?
Oh, well, what are you going to read?
Yeah, so I'm actually trying to get hold of one of her very few books of poetry. I believe there are only two, and there's one, A Year of Birds, and apparently she has written a poem for each calendar month, and with some drawings and illustrations to go with it. And yeah, I'm very curious to read that. So
tell us how you get on with that.
Having read it, yes.
I want to read it too now. Thank you so much. Wonderful talking to you. Thank you to our audience too for your questions and for our marvellous, companionable guests, Hannah Altorf, Lucy Bolton and Mara-Daria Cojocaru. Do join us again.